Today's lecture is on the agricultural revolution, and you can see I put a burlap sack background there to let you know that. Hopefully you enjoy the background. It might make it kind of hard to see though, so sorry about that. Well, in general, for many centuries, the food supply in Europe, just like the rest of the world, was really quite uncertain. Every once in a while, probably about every third year or so, there were disappointing harvests. The amount of grains and so on that the people wanted to produce was not as much as they wanted. Due to cold weather, rainy weather, dry weather, hot weather, there's all kinds of different ways that your harvest can be screwed up. There could be some sort of infestation of insects or something like that too. Anyway, every once in a while, about every third year or so on average, there was a lack of food or a shortage of food that caused price increases and caused hunger. Now, peasants are generally conservative both in terms of how they farm or their farm techniques. They're also, let's be honest, peasants or people in the rural areas are also oftentimes socially conservative and politically conservative unless unless they are short of land and want to change. Anyway, peasants weren't really changing their methods. Imagine experimenting with your livelihood in that way, and if your experiment went wrong, your family starves to death. So you can imagine that they're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, year after year after year, learning how to farm from older people in the village or from their family. And so all the way up until the 18th century or the 1700s, most everybody was continuing with traditional agriculture. And traditional agriculture was based on a three-field system of crop rotation. If you look at the image that we have over on the right-hand side, you can see the village in the middle, and then these arable strips, and then some pasture land or the commons land, and then woods, and then the land holdings of one farmer. Anyway, what farmers and entire villages would do, in fact, is have a spring crop that they would plant and harvest that was about 1/3 of the land holdings, and then they would have a fall crop, same kind of thing, where they would be planting and harvesting in the fall, and then they would leave 1/3 of the land fallow. In other words, they wouldn't plant anything on it. And the reason that they would do that is if you keep planting over and over and over again on the same bit of land, after a while, of the nutrients in the land get used up, and then you're really not producing very much at all. Leaving it fallow allows organic matter to fall on it, and it allows the soil to recover a little bit. So they were rotating in this way. What was the spring crop land becomes the fall crop land, and so on and so forth. All of that pasture land that you see there in the green is called common land, and that was shared. It wasn't planted on. That's really where people let their animals that they owned forage or just kind of wander around and nibble at whatever they could find. Everybody in this traditional agricultural scheme worked together. They all went out at the same time and planted. They all went out at the same time and weeded. They all went out at the same time and harvested. Why the long strips, do you think? This is a good chance for somebody to chime in. I will pause. Why do you think they were planting and owning land in long strips? Yeah, and that thing along the ground that a horse is pulling or an ox is pulling is a plow, and the plow is churning up the soil. You break up the soil, you churn up the soil in order to put seeds in it. If the seed is placed or planted a little bit deeper than just sowing the seed, throwing it on top of the soil, it's going to grow better and produce more. So yeah, you don't want to turn that plow, you don't want to turn the horse, you don't want to turn the ox too often, and so that's why it's done in this way. And now the land is owned in strips as well, and you can see that the land holdings of one farmer is that orange bit. That's also maybe kind of weird to you. It looks a little weird to me. It kind of reminds me of like the weirdness of the Holy Roman Empire and the vomit of Skittles. The reason that they would own land in this very strange way is because different land has very different fertility. And so you don't want one farmer to be to own, all the crummy land and one farmer to own all the great land. That land would be fertile in very different ways from east to west, north to south, and so on. So the large landowners, and if you can imagine, not everybody has the same amount of land in that land ownership scheme or in that land scheme. The large landowners tended to be the local noble, or if you didn't have a local noble, you could have a wealthy gentry person. A gentry person is basically a large landowner who doesn't have a noble title. You have a lot of gentry people in England or in Britain, because if you remember, they have primogeniture. In other words, the eldest son of a family, of a noble family, is the one that inherits the title, and everyone else is just a commoner, but let's face it, a rich and an educated commoner too. Smaller landowners, farmers, peasants, sometimes serfs actually owned a little bit of land or were allowed to have a little bit of land too, were also part of this scheme as well. So imagine people having different amounts of land as land ownership. The peasants generally worked the landowner's land. You don't have a noble or a wealthy gentry person actually out there doing the work in the fields. They would the peasants would rent land from a large landowner. Peasants, or they were doing this either through payment of the landowner or through sharecropping. In other words, paying with part of the crop. The serfs generally didn't own anything. They generally worked the land and generally then got what they needed from the produce, from what was produced. And then they also had little vegetable gardens that they worked as well. At this point in time, going up into the 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution happens, or before a lot of banking is going on and stuff like that, land is really a measure of wealth. And it creates wealth too, just like the physiocrats we're talking about during the Enlightenment. It is a measure of people's economic standing, and it creates more wealth for them. More and more, as we get closer to the present, excess crop was sold in markets. As more people moved to urban areas, there was a larger market for the crops that come from the countryside, and so that became even more profitable as time went by. As a larger proportion of the population were no longer living in the fields or living in the countryside, making what they needed in terms of agricultural produce. Now, the smallholders really didn't benefit from this move towards more market agriculture, towards selling excess crop, because quite frankly, smallholders, of people with just a little bit of land, are really producing pretty much everything that they needed and that they would consume themselves, and they don't have a lot left over. Whereas the big landowners are, they're being paid in kind or paid in crop, or they just have a lot of crop that they're not going to be able to eat themselves. And so they are sending it on to markets in the towns. There's also inflation going on really from the 1500s on, and a price increase is going to benefit people who have excess that they can sell. So large landowners are benefiting from the inflation. They're benefiting from the expanding markets. They think about how they could possibly increase their profit as well. So there were some innovations that came about really around the time of the scientific revolution or the time of the Enlightenment. You think about how both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment would be trying to use reason and experimentation in order to improve society. Well, you could improve agriculture by thinking about and experimenting with new agricultural techniques. And if you think about it too, it's really just the people who have the large land holdings who don't mind, messing up a crop. They're not going to starve to death if some of their crops get messed up, whereas a smallholder isn't going to do this. Anyway, some of the innovations were here's a mechanical device called the seed drill, and this is something that is invented by Jethro Tull. The seed drill is a kind of device on a wheel, and it drops a seed in a very regular way every once in a while with the turn of the wheel. So that's going to space out the crops and allow them to grow much more effectively. They also realized too that this thing on the right and this thing on the left in those pictures, the turnip is on the left, and then the clover is on the right. That if you planted clover and turnips instead of leaving your fields fallow, that would actually improve the soil. Both of those plants put nitrogen into the soil, and in addition to enriching the soil already, you could have animals eat those things and create manure, which you could also put on your soil, which would enrich your soil. There was a guy who was named Charles Townsend, who in fact was an advocate for the turnip. He told people to plant the turnip, told them that it basically improved the soil, enriched the soil, and some people who had the wherewithal to do that started to do that. Animals, like I said, produce manure or fertilizer. In addition to the animals eating those crops, animals are very tasty. And so the animals' meat was being added to the food supply. There were more animals available to eat. And there were even people who started to, in a much more scientific way, think about how breeding animals with certain characteristics that you would like to have in an animal, would be really quite a good idea. By the way, what sorts of cows or chickens or sheep or whatever, what kinds of characteristics would you like to have in any one of those animals? Can you give me an example of something? Tasty. Yeah, maybe tasty. Go ahead. Uh, okay, yeah. More tame. Yeah, I could get that. Easier to deal with. Something else? Okay, pull more weight. Something else? Bigger. What would bigger help us with? More meat. Good. How about chickens? I love chickens. What kind of a chicken would you want to breed? Perfect. Yeah. So imagine that chickens, I don't know if you know this, but chickens nowadays lay eggs about 18 every 18 hours or so. And we've basically created that. Think about a bird in nature. And how often do you think a bird in nature would lay an egg based on wanting to create, baby birds? Okay, maybe once every spring. So to create a Franken chicken, where it would be laying an egg every 18 hours, you're taking the chickens that lay eggs more frequently and you keep breeding them, and you just eat the ones, don't let the ones that don't do that breed. And before you know it, you have these weird chickens that lay an egg every 18 hours. Great if you want eggs, terrible for the chicken probably. There's no reason, evolutionarily speaking or biologically speaking, that a chicken needs to, produce an egg every once in a while like that. But yeah, so cows that produce more milk, or if you have a meat animal, then bigger animal or more meat, more food, all that kind of stuff. So that's eugenics. Eugenics is selective breeding to create the characteristics that you would want. Sadly, in the 20th century, they're going to start suggesting that for people, and then we get into some really sort of nasty philosophies that we'll talk about later. Well, something that I didn't know about when I was studying history and then learned about, which is really quite important, is something called enclosure movements or enclosure acts. And the enclosure acts you find in Britain, and what the enclosure acts are a move towards a more modern form of agriculture and a more capitalistic kind of agriculture. The old way of doing planting and agriculture was very communal. Everybody, like I said, would plant together and work together and harvest together, and and it was a very sort of socialistic almost way of doing farming. And they're moving towards a more modern, individualistic kind of agriculture, almost like the invisible hand, like what's good for me as a landowner. And so what they decided to do in Britain was to divide up and start to plant on the common pasture land or the common land. And they would divide up the common land based on the amount of land that somebody owned in the fields already. So the large landowners were getting a larger slice of this common land, and people were being kicked off the common land. They would then, let's say that their wandering animals would be kicked off this pasture land or the common land. And as these larger landowners started to get larger plots of land, it was also decided that they would consolidate their patches of land, or the parts that they owned, and then oftentimes fence it so that, for example, a large landowner could have a bunch of sheep on their land. Instead of planting something on it, they might just have sheep on it because they're getting money from the wool of those sheep, or maybe selling those sheep for slaughter and getting the money from in that way. They don't maybe need to plant um, crops on their land. Anyway, you can kind of see this happening in the bottom image, where you had a whole bunch of different people who owned land before the Enclosure Acts, and then you can see that really only 3 people own land after the Enclosure Acts. All the larger landowners bought up all of the smallholders and were using agricultural revolution techniques like the seed drill, like the planting of clover or turnips or so on, in order to even increase the amount of agricultural produce that they were producing. So they're buying up all of this land. I do like, by the way, that it says Baron's land, but not me, but a real Baron. Um, and buying up the smallholders. This is a huge disruption of rural society, as people were selling their land and becoming landless laborers. People at that point in time said, sheep eat men, which meant that, sometimes a large landowner would stop planting crops and would just have sheep on their land instead. If it was more profitable, from an invisible hand sort of thing, your selfish economic interests, then you might want to do that. The question is then, what would all those people who just sold their land do? And why don't I just go ahead and ask that so you can chime in? What do you think the people who just sold their land, they now became landless laborers, what are they going to do? Perfect. Exactly right. They're going to work as hired laborers for that landowner, or maybe rent that person's land too. But with the consolidation of agriculture, there were actually far more people working in the fields than you needed. And so there's a whole bunch of people who are left over who don't really have anything to do in the fields. There is, though, a job for them. Uh, I'll tell you about that in just a second. Let me tell you then about how this enclosure thing works and how we start to get these larger land holdings. These acts, or these enclosures, have to be approved by the British Parliament. Every village where this happens has to have this happen, and there has to be 51% of the not of the people who owned land, but 51% of the land represented had to want this, and then go to Parliament and ask for this to happen. Generally, large landowners who had a connection to Parliament would already own 51% of the land, and they push these things through. And the smallholders, who felt like the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, had a few disturbances here and there, but there were no large-scale rebellions, and the little disturbances were put down. That's what happens in Britain. In Britain, you have smallholders being bought out. In the French case, though, right across the English Channel, something very different happened. What you'll see happening in this unit is that the French had a revolution, and the French peasants, the smallholders, actually got the land of the large landholders. And so the smaller peasant landholders are increasing their land and becoming, let's say, farmers. That's my term for people who own a little bit more land. And by the way, what do you think is happening? Those of you who know a little something about the French Revolution, what do you think is happening to the large landowners of France, like the noble landowners of France? Good. They get their heads chopped off. Exactly. Or they get chased away. So there's a real difference in land holding patterns between Britain and France, and it works out really quite differently in terms of the Industrial Revolution because of that. And now onto the Industrial Revolution. This huge disruption of British society with these enclosure acts meant that the smallholders had to sell their plots. They couldn't exist without the common land. They couldn't exist without having those animals using that common land as pasture land. And so they generally started to do something called the domestic system, or the putting out system. This is a kind of, they also call it the cottage industry. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. And then, you know, they were working in their cottages for a while, not working in their fields, but they weren't tied to the village anymore. And eventually, when jobs open up in cities, they start to move to cities eventually. Now, the landowners in Britain are once again doing this invisible hand thing. They're doing this sort of selfish economic interest. They're doing capitalism. They're thinking much more about profit than they are about the way that the communal agriculture used to work. And so they are really doing what Adam Smith advocates. They're doing a kind of laissez-faire, a sort of let it be kind of economic system, that if you're rich and you have the wherewithal, you do whatever you want with your property. But another bit of laissez-faire or let it be has to do with the government not intervening in the economy. And wouldn't you agree with me that the government is actively intervening in the economy to make these enclosure acts possible? It's the parliament that is allowing the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer because of these enclosure acts. So I would suggest that that's not really laissez-faire or letting it be at all. Here's that domestic industry, the putting out system, the cottage industry, or whatever you want to call it. There are people who had capital, people who had wealth, people who had money, who became known as entrepreneurs. People want to take the money that they have and increase it. Now, these entrepreneurs have capital, but they also have knowledge of markets. They know that if they produce something, that they could take it and send it far away from where it's being produced and fill a market somewhere not in that locale. So what an entrepreneur would do is go, especially in times when villagers weren't working in the fields initially, they would go to villagers and say, "Listen, I've got all of this wool, and I've got these spinning wheels, and I've got some looms, and I will let you use these things. You take the wool and spin it for me, or you take the loom and weave thread for me and make cloth for me. And then I'll come back by at some point in time and pick those things up and pay you." So those peasants who were doing nothing in the colder parts of the year loved this because they were making some extra money in times when they usually wouldn't be doing anything. And so they're manufacturing, or it's a kind of industry in their cottages. This works out really quite nicely. The entrepreneur is using this really cheap labor. The cheap labor is getting paid something, and they are producing goods that this entrepreneur is then taking elsewhere and selling for a much lower price than what somebody in the city who was part of a guild, who was a really skilled weaver or skilled spinner, would be doing. I like to call this kind of a Walmartization of the economy. You're creating cheaper goods, but goods of far less quality. Hopefully that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions about that, or do you kind of get what's going on? Okay, good. Hop in if you need me to explain that again. Well, this agricultural revolution that's happening, all of these new techniques by these larger landowners are creating even more wealth for the larger landowners that could be invested in eventually the real industrial revolution, which is going to be occurring in the cities. And this also kicking people off of the land, buying out their small holdings, creates a mobile population for people to move to those cities to engage in real, factory industry. Now, this move towards the rich getting richer in the countryside and the poor getting poor in the countryside really works best in Britain, maybe less successfully than Britain in Western Europe, but certainly in a much bigger way than what you have in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, from Prussia, from the Habsburg Empire, from Russia, you really have a continuation of serfdom. And serfdom is, the serfs don't really own land, and the land owners don't have to buy them out. They have this unfree immobile labor force that they need to employ in their fields. And so there isn't a mobile population, and there isn't a great deal of capital that is being produced in Eastern Europe. So we see a kind of continuing good growth, capitalistic growth in Western Europe, and kind of a continuation of this slower growth agricultural market in the East. So less capital, fewer mobile workers, slow industrial growth in the East. And over time, starting in the 1800s, really industry is what gives nations power, military power, and goes hand in hand with economic power, I guess. Okay, that's that.